And so we returned to my grandparents and with the hopes of being able to leave later. Well, 2 weeks later, Hitler declared war on Poland. All borders were closed and we could not get out.
By his latest act of naked aggression, Hitler has committed a crime not only against Poland, but against the whole human race. Since Hitler has chosen war, in spite of all the chances given him to avoid it, war there must be.
Welcome to Heroes Behind Headlines. Today we're honored to welcome Marlies DiFante. Marlies is a grandmother living in upstate New York and the author of an excellent book named Queen of the Bremen. Back in 1939, she was a young girl growing up with her older brother Peter, mother, and father in Naples, New York. She had no idea the world was about to explode into chaos. That very same summer, June 1939, she left with her family aboard the German passenger ship, the SS Bremen, so her mother could visit her terminally ill father in Germany. Marlies was 5 years old at the time and had no idea that German Chancellor Adolf Hitler was about to launch a massive invasion of Poland that would mark the start of World War II. Nor did she know that her family's planned 3-month stay with her grandparents in Germany would turn into a 7-year struggle to stay alive as an American girl stuck in the living hell of Nazi Germany, and that bombing attacks, near starvation, and harassment by the Hitler Youth, German SS, and other deprivations would test her will to survive. The amazing and inspiring Marlies DiFante is today's hero behind the headlines.
Well, I grew up in Naples, New York, and it all started with my father was a German soldier in the First World War, and he was wounded twice. He was in the cavalry. And when the war ended, there was a big depression in Germany, and so he contacted an uncle in Wisconsin, here in the United States, and his uncle sponsored him, and he decided to come to America. Before that, he paid his uncle back whatever it cost him to bring him to the United States. And then he found employment in Canisius, New York, because that was my father's business. He went to school in Germany for Weinbau, school in the city of Trier. And he learned all about grapes and how to grow them and all the vineyards, how to take care of them. And that was his profession. And that's where he ended up going for a position in Canisius. Well, while he was there, he received a letter from Germany telling him his mother was very ill, and he decided to go home and visit her. And while he was there, he met my mother, and he thought she was the most beautiful person he'd ever met. And so they got to know each other over a period of maybe a week or so, and my father was determined he wanted to marry her. And when he asked her, she said, no, I don't think I can leave Germany and go to America and leave my family. And so she refused. So my father came back to America. He wrote to her for 2 years. And his letters were just something that she was impressed by. And all of a sudden, she gets a notice from his mother from the small town where she had actually been employed as a seamstress, asking her to come and see her. So when my mother went to see my father's mother, she was on her deathbed. And she said to my mother, Elizabeth, you've got to marry John, because without you, I don't think he has much of a hope, no future. So my mother couldn't deny a dying mother. So she said, yes, she would marry him. And right away, she went home, talked to her father, and her father said, when you make a promise to a dying mother, you have to keep it. So she wrote to my father in Canisius and told him she would marry him. Well, he couldn't get on the fastest ship to Germany, which at that time, again, was the Bremen. And because I think that was the only ocean liner that was actually sailing back and forth. And that's when he came the first time, and he also went back and he went there to marry my mother. And that was in 1932. And they came right back from, as soon as they were married, they came back to the United States, and they went up to the St. Michael's Mission, where my mother was really lonely because they were all old priests and she had no young people. And she was 26 years old, and she needed to have company. But a year after they were married, my brother Peter was born at that mission, which was the first time they ever had a baby born there. And so actually, my father wasn't earning enough money, so he found a position in Naples, New York. And he had gone to school with Will Widmer, who owned the Widmer wine cellar. Well, when Will Widmer found out it was John Adams, he hired him right away because he knew my father knew his business. And a year after Peter was born, I was born. And it was awesome being in Naples. The town was all German, and everybody only spoke German.
Really?
So that's
Wow.
all Peter and I really knew was German. But my mother taught us the American prayers. So we had to learn our prayers, go to church on Sunday. And, we did pretty good with those. But other than that, we knew no English. And Peter started school and was in kindergarten. And he would come home and teach me quite a few words. And so I was learning slowly because I was only a year younger. And then my mother received a letter from Germany telling her father was dying of cancer.
Oh, boy.
Well, she became so homesick that when they went to the doctor said, John, you've got to take her home. I don't have medication for her. It's depression. Take her back. And that was in 1939. And she also knew that she was pregnant with the third child. So now my father decided we would all go together because this way we could finally meet some family members because all there was in Naples was my father, my mother, and Peter and I. So now we got on the big ship, which to us was just amazing. I was 5 years old. Peter was 6. And one night we had to perform for the passengers. And neither one of us had any talent. So my mother dressed us in matching sailor suits. And we went in front of the audience and we said the Our Father, first in German and then in English. And they named us King and Queen of the ship.
This was the Bremen, USS Bremen.
The Bremen, yes. And we left there and went to meet my family, and they came from a small town in Germany near the border of, near the city of Trier, which was close to Luxembourg. The border's right there. Well, my family came from a small town called Kell, Kell. And when we first arrived, when my mother got off the ship and went into a restaurant in Germany, was the first time she was able to keep food in her stomach because everything before that she would vomit and she was actually dying. And it's a good thing my father brought her home.
Wow. So she was really suffering from the deep depression.
She was in deep depression. And so as soon as she went to a restaurant and was able to keep food in her stomach, she was amazed herself that all of a sudden she was home. So now we lived with my grandparents, the farm, and to find 11 uncles and aunts and grandparents and all the animals. It was amazing. And so we were there with them for just 2 weeks when we got a notice that all passengers had to leave Germany, that we had to get back to the Bremer Harbor, which is Bremerhaven in German. And we had a report there, which was sad because my father had planned on staying 3 months. And so that ended very quickly. When we got to Bremen, the Bremen Harbor, the doctor there examined my mother and he said, Mrs. Adams, you're 7 months pregnant and the ship is overcrowded. We have no room to take you aboard. You have to wait till the baby is born and then you will be able to come back. And so we returned to my grandparents and with the hopes of being able to leave later. Well, 2 weeks later, Hitler declared war on Poland. All borders were closed and we could not get out.
Because German doctors discovered that Marlie's mother was 7 months pregnant, she and her family were not allowed to reboard the SS Bremen for the trip back to New York City. This turned into an even bigger problem a few weeks later, on September 1st, 1939, when German Chancellor Adolph Hitler launched a surprise blitzkrieg, or lightning war attack on Poland, involving 60 divisions and 1.5 million men. Great Britain responded by abandoning its past policy of appeasement and declaring war on Germany. France followed soon thereafter, and World War II began. This meant that Marlies and her family were prisoners. American citizens trapped behind enemy lines.
And so we went back, and now my father is concerned. How is he going to provide for us? How long is this going to take before they let us go? And the first thing we had to do was my father and mother had to report to Nazi headquarters because they were informed right away that we never got on that ship. And I found out years later that that ship had 1,170 passengers on it. And when it was 2 days outside of docking in New York, Hitler ordered the captain to bring that ship back with all the passengers. Do not continue on to New York. Well, he disobeyed that order, went to New York and dropped those passengers off and went back with an empty ship. And you can imagine what happened to the captain.
Yeah. Wow. What a brave man. Wow.
Yeah, you did not disobey Hitler. So I feel sorry, but I know that man he never lived after that.
Yeah, I'm sure.
So now my parents had to report to headquarters, and the first thing they told my father was that he had to find employment and that they were not going to guarantee us any time as to when we could leave, and we were prisoners. So now they told him that they couldn't give him any direct time as to when we would ever go back, and of course we can't. You're not leaving. So now they gave us rations, and my father had to find employment, which he found through my mother's brother, who worked in the city of Rüsselsheim, which is near Frankfurt, Mainz, those big industrial cities. And in Rüsselsheim, they had a huge ammunition factory, the Opel factory, where later on they made Opel cars here in the United States. You remember the Opel cars?
That's right, of course.
Well, they were actually made there.
No kidding. At a munitions factory. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
And so now my father found employment there because all of the German men were being drafted, and my uncle was one of them that had to leave, and his position was available, but not for my father, because my father was now considered a prisoner, even though he had fought in the First World War for Germany, but he had left and became an American citizen, and that canceled all his German citizenship, and my mother never had the $15 to become American citizen. So when she left here, she was not a citizen of the United States, and she had lost her German citizenship because she had married an American and left the country for 7 years.
Uh-huh. So she was sort of in between legal status.
She had no status, none, nowhere. So now they told us that these are the restrictions they put on us, that we could not speak any English ever again, that we only received half of the rations of the German people, and they received hardly enough to stay alive on. We could never go into the forest for any kind of, to pick up wood and stuff for our for heat. We could not go into the orchards because that was only for German people, but not for us. And that's the restrictions they first put on us. But then they started, when we left my grandparents and moved to Rüsselsheim, the city of Rüsselsheim, just before that, I had fallen and I had scraped my arm outside playing and never realizing that it was very serious. And by the next day, my mother could not get the dress over my arm because my arm was so swollen. And so she brought me to the hospital, and the doctor, oh my gosh, he screamed at her. He says, "Get away from that child." He says, "She's got what they call in German Wundrose, which is a staph infection, a severe staph infection in my arm."
Oh, wow. So that could have been very dangerous for a pregnant woman. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
And so now they had me in the hospital, and they contacted my mother and said that they needed permission from both my mother and my father. They had to amputate my arm.
Oh, my God.
And my father at that time was in Rüsselsheim. He was not in Kiel with my mother. And she contacted him, and he said, "No, they cannot cut my daughter's arm off. I will never give them permission. We're in a war, and I don't know what could happen to her." And he said, "No." So the doctor was very upset. And he said to my mother, "If you don't do this, you're going to lose her. I cannot keep that girl alive." Because now I'd already gone into a coma, and my arm was swollen, probably the size of a stovepipe. And I didn't even know my mother and father were there, or my mother was there to see me. And she told the doctor, she said, "I will not allow you to remove my daughter's arm because I'm going to trust in God that maybe he will help her." and the doctor threw her out of the hospital, told her to go. Well, it seemed like it was maybe 5-6 days. And all of a sudden, for some reason, they couldn't explain, the fever broke. And I got well. And the doctor embraced my mother and said, I wish I had the faith that you have.
Wow. That's
That was the first
story.
miracle that I believe that was given to my family and given to me. Thank God for my parents.
You were in a coma this whole time?
Oh, yes.
Yeah, so you really don't really remember anything.
No, I don't recall. And so now, after I was well, we moved to Rüsselsheim and we started school.
Where your father's working?
Yes, we moved there and they gave us an apartment in a 4-family house. The other 3 families around us were Nazi families, and the walls were so thin you could hear through them. So they had a constant watch on us. That wasn't the bad part. It was every time my mother turned around, they were calling her into the city. Now, the distance from where we lived, which was the outskirts, and they called it the Siedlung, that was outskirts of the city. It was a 5-mile walk into the city. And that's where my father had to go every day to go to work.
He had to walk to work.
Yes. My uncle gave him a bicycle when he left to go into the war. He gave him his bicycle, and that helped in the summertime. But in the wintertime, Peter and I, we had to walk that far to go to school. And it was not easy, but it was something. And we also had to walk that far to get to church, but we never missed going to church on Sunday. And so anyway, now we're in the city, and now they're asking her on a constant, it seemed like every time she turned around, they were asking her to come into the city. They wanted to see her papers, which were our birth certificates, my mother and father's birth certificate, his naturalization papers, and our tickets to return to the United States. Every time she went with the same papers, and every time she went, they cut something from our rations. So now, all of a sudden, they cut away all of our rations as far as soap was concerned. They cut all of our heat rations. So now they cut all of those rations, but they gave us 3 cards for bread 3 times a week, which was Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. The only problem was you had to be in line by at least 6 o'clock in the morning for the bakery to open at 9.
Okay.
So we would take turns. We would get up in the morning, and Peter would go and stand in line for an hour, and then I would stand in line for over an hour, and then we would go home and get ready for school. My mother would take our place, and she would stand in line. And now, if you were too far back in line, there was always some SS that would be standing at the door, and all depended on what kind of a mood he was in. Sometimes he would let 15, 20 people in. Other times only 10, sometimes only 5. And then when the bakery door closed, your ration card was no good anymore. So if you were too far back in line, you did not get rations that day. So now you hoped for the next day. And then the same thing could happen again. If you were lucky to get 1 loaf of bread a week, it was a lot.
Wow.
But if you were a Nazi, belonged to the Nazi party, you didn't have a ration card. And you could go in the back door of the bakery and get all the bread you wanted. So that's what made many German people join the Nazi party.
Interesting.
Because they needed that food for their
to
families.
survive. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
And the German people didn't have much more than we did, but we had a lot less.
Right. So for a lot of people, it was just a practical decision.
Yes. Yes. To try to keep your children alive, you know. But the Nazis had everything. So it was easy. If you joined the Nazi party, you had things coming to your way and you didn't have to worry about a thing. So we started our little garden in the back. And then most of the time I was living on dandelions, clover, chamomile. In Germany, chamomile grows like weeds, almost like our dandelions here. And it's the most healthy food you could possibly ever get. And I would go out and find dandelions, and I would eat the flowers and whatever, anything green, grass, whatever, just to have something in my stomach because, oh my gosh, you get so hungry. And then the worst part was when the bombing started.
Mm-hmm. This is the Allied bombing.
Yes. Well, it was actually the English that came
British
first. And they used to come, oh my gosh, it seemed like every other night or and when they came, they would drop bombs. And it was always around 11, 12 o'clock they would come. So now if you're in bed sleeping and that alarm goes off, if you do not get into an underground area, your chances of survival are 0. Because the air pressure killed more people than the bombs themselves. And so when the alarm would go off, you would get out of your bed and everything in your body reacted. You started shaking. You started to feel cold. You feel warm. You started vomiting. You have diarrhea. There is nothing you can do to stop because you know that today is going to be your last day. You know you're going to die. That was what you looked forward to on a daily basis when those bombers came. And when they dropped those bombs, they would leave craters so big that you could put a foundation of a house in there. Huge holes in the ground.
And of course, you were in a city that was where they had munitions plants and so on. So it was a target. Yeah.
And that was a big target.
Right.
And what they would do is, being on the outskirts, which was where the planes usually would let their bombs off. So you would hear those bombs rattling over the top of your house before they exploded. And if you were in your cellar and you didn't have your mouth open when one of those bombs blew up, you would blow out all of your hearing.
World War II spiraled into total war. After the initial attack on London by the German Luftwaffe in April 1940, described as, quote, happening accidentally and against Hitler's orders, the bombing wars began. Previously, bombing was targeted to military bases and strategic military targets. Soon after April 1940 and the first city raid, the stance shifted to include mass bombing of cities. Britain soon retaliated with bombing raids over German cities, which spurred on further raids from the Germans and so on. Soon, targeted Allied bombing campaigns became less restrictive. Military targets turned into industrial targets, which eventually turned into a dehousing campaign to inflict terror on German citizens. For those on the ground like Marlie's family, which now included a newborn baby, the bombings were horrific. Many millions of human beings were killed, and millions of others forced into a state of shock, left with permanent dismemberment, physical and mental damage, fear, and general uncertainty.
And so to keep a baby's mouth open through a bombing is almost impossible. But God was on our side, because as soon as that alarm would go off, that baby would start to scream. And he would scream throughout the entire bombing. And he would grab my mother by the neck, and he would hold on to her neck so tight that when she came out of that cellar, her neck was completely black and blue. But it kept his mouth open, and it saved his hearing, and it was something that we felt like doing as well. And I remember the worst part is, even today, I can still hear my mother praying in the cellar, Lord, if you're going to take us tonight, please let us all go together. Well, that to me was the worst prayer that I ever heard. I never wanted to hear it, but she said it all the time, and it used to make me cry, because I thought, why is my mother asking to die with all of us? She wants us all to die, and I couldn't understand that as a child.
Right, of course.
It was very hard.
Yeah.
But anyway, we managed through. But the sad part about it was, when they dropped those bombs, sometimes they used to release phosphor from the plane, and it would come down like rain. And when that phosphor ended up on your vegetables in the garden, you could not eat them.
Yeah.
It would poison the vegetables. So now the little bit of food we tried to keep for ourselves was, my father had brought home from the Opel factory 2 small rabbits. And we raised them, and we would feed one rabbit the vegetables from the ground after a bombing. And if that rabbit survived, we could eat what was above ground.
Yeah.
But the rabbit did end up dying, so our vegetables were gone. But we could eat the potatoes and carrots and
things that grew underground,
onions, anything that grew underground. So that kept us going. And I remember one night there was no food in the house at all, and we were not allowed to go into the orchard to find anything. And I told my brother Peter, it was a moonlit night, and I said, Peter, he had brought his little red wagon from the Red and White in Naples. And thank God we had that little red wagon with us, because I said, Peter, let's take your wagon. We're going to go into the forest. It's already 9:00, and I'm sure the Nazis above us are sleeping. They won't see us leave, so we can sneak out. And my mother said, "Oh my gosh, I can't let you children go." And I said, "Mama, we got to find something we have no food." So we decided, it was 9 o'clock at night. We took our little wagon and we went alongside of there was actually a long forest area that you had to go through before you could get to the orchard. And we went along there and we got into the orchard, and my mother had told us, whatever you do, never pick an apple from a tree, because that would be stealing, and I would rather starve than steal. And I looked at Peter and I thought, well, maybe she feels that way. But boy, when you're hungry, I really guess it doesn't matter. But
sorry, Mom. Yeah.
We had to obey, and we were used to obeying. So we get into the orchard, and the German people were just as hungry as we were. So they had already picked up all the apples. There was nothing, not even an apple that was half rotten. There was nothing on the ground. So I felt so disappointed. I said, "Peter, if you climb in a tree and shake the branches and the apples fall on the ground and I pick them up, it won't be stealing." And he said, "Are you sure?" And I said, "She said, as long as they're on the ground." So he said, "Let's try it." Well, he climbed into the tree, and that was the next miracle that we received, because it's still strange to me how many apples fell off of that tree when Peter shook the branches.
Mm-hmm.
They just kept falling. And I was down below picking up those apples and putting them in the potato sack I had in the wagon. I was so happy to see those apples. And all of a sudden, Peter said, "Marlies, you got to watch out. There's a man coming." And he saw from the tree that someone was coming. So he's as fast as he could, he climbed out of that tree. We grabbed the wagon. I was in the back. He took the handle in the front, and we started running in the opposite direction. And he said, "Somebody must have seen us. They called the Gestapo. Somebody must have seen." And we kept running, and my foot started to slip into a bomb hole. Thank God Peter saw it. And I was hanging on to the back of that wagon like I was putting my fingers through the steel on that wagon, because I was so afraid. And he pulled me out of that hole. If he hadn't done that, I could have pulled him into the bomb hole, and we would have died in there, because there's groundwater comes up, and when it rains, it becomes like a huge sinkhole. And there's nothing to hang on to get out of there unless somebody's there with a rope to pull you out.
Right.
And
wow.
so there was another miracle.
In. Yeah. Wow.
And we made it home, and we were sitting behind a house, most likely for, I would say, an hour. And we just to get our hearts back into our chest, just to start breathing properly again, to stop crying, and to put on a big front for my mother and father so that they wouldn't know something was wrong. And we finally went to the door, and my mother said, "Oh my God, where have you been? It's 11 o'clock. She says, "I've been so worried." And I said, "Mom, it takes a long time to find apples." We never told her what we really went through. And she looked at the apples and she said, "Are you sure you didn't pick these from a tree?" I said, "Mom, there's not a single apple in that bag that came from that we picked from the tree." Oh, we waited years later when we told her what we really did. She's up in heaven now. I know she is, and I'm sure she asked God, "Did those kids really steal or not?" I don't know.
I bet those apples tasted good.
They were delicious, and it was something for my father to eat, But anyway, we made it home, and the order came that all that belonged to the Hitler Youth. Well, my mother was very concerned. She says, "If my children join the Hitler Youth, they're never going to be able to get back to America." And that concerned my mother and father very gravely.
Mm-hmm.
So
do you remember what year this was approximately? Well,
I was 7 and he was 8. So it was, a couple of years after the war.
So it was like 43, maybe, something like that?
And it was even before, because I've seen on the internet where they've said that the children were actually conducted into the Hitler Youth when they were 10 years of age. They came from me. I was 7. He was 8. So the things you hear on the internet are not always true. And so when my mother said, "Well, she started to pray. And when the Gestapo came and said, "Your children have to join the Hitler Youth," my mother said, "Are you sure that Hitler wants my children? They're American citizens, And they said, "Oh, we'll have to let you know." They came back 2 days later and said, we do not want them. They can never join the Hitler Youth. Hitler does not want foreigners in his Hitler Youth. Well, that was a big win for my mother and father, but it was a big loss for Peter and I. Because now we were the only ones not going to Hitler Youth meetings. We were the only ones not wearing uniforms, and it didn't take
All
the
the
German
kids
children.
wore them. All the kids
Oh, yeah.
wore them.
Oh, they all had to belong.
Everybody.
There was everybody had to be in the Hitler Youth. And he used the Hitler Youth. He trained those young children, 13, 14 years old, how to be up in the towers during a bombing and shoot down planes.
With a
because
rifle?
the Nazis weren't they had machine guns. They were up in those towers. They were trained to shoot down planes.
At 13 years old.
Oh, yes. 12, 13, 14 years old. By the time they were 16 or 17, they were already on their way into being soldiers. But that's what they were doing because the Nazis weren't going to go put their lives on the line and sit in the tower. They didn't care if the kids got killed. That was their problem. And then they would send letters to the German soldiers. Do you know the German soldiers probably would never have fought for 6 years if they had known what really was happening in Germany? But we had that big liar, Goebbels, that one who got on the radio, propaganda man who lied about everything. And he was telling the German soldiers, Germany is winning the war. We're winning in this country. We're winning over here. All lies. They couldn't even fly their planes because they didn't have any fuel. The soldiers were fighting in Russia with 3 bullets between 20 men. They were fighting with bayonets because they didn't have any ammunition. It was all lies.
All lies. So he controlled everything.
They controlled everything. Everything. They controlled everything. And then what they did was when a family was killed in a bombing and a soldier was in Russia, they used the young girls in the Hitler Youth to write letters to tell them that their family was fine. There was some disturbance in the city, but nothing more. The cities were leveled. And the soldiers did not know it.
Wow. And
now they come home and they find everything that they had worked for or fought for is gone. They would have never fought for 6 years. That would have been true. But that's what happens when there's lies and propaganda that should not be put out on the news. But that's the way it was. All lies. And then they had, when it came to actually, when we weren't allowed to join the Hitler Youth, it was constant fighting for Peter and I. We go to school. We go very early so we could miss seeing the other children. And we would leave school right away. As soon as that bell rang, we left that school and ran almost all the way home to avoid being hurt by them. They would run their bicycles into our legs. They would throw stones at us. They threw sticks at us. They spit at us. They knocked Peter down many times, gave him a bloody nose. And there wasn't a single teacher who helped us.
Wow. Wow.
Peter would come into school.
The teachers would see it and they wouldn't do anything.
No, they couldn't help us because that's the way it was. We were not American. We were not Germans. And they used to call us the dirty ummies. Do you know that ummies, that's short for Americans.
Ah, okay.
We were the dirty ummies. And I hated to be called that. And I used to tell my mother, why can't we just join the Hitler Youth? I said to her, I only speak German. My grandparents are German. I've got 7 uncles fighting in the German army. You and Dad are German. I said, and we live in Germany. Why can't we just join the Hitler Youth? She said, you can't because we will never get back to America. I said, I don't even know what America is. I had forgotten what it was like to live in freedom and peace and food and all the good stuff.
Yeah, sure.
You forget very quickly when it's not available. And I said, I don't want to go back to America and I don't want to be a dirty ummy. I just want to be a German. And she said, well, it can't be that way. And one day she had to come into the city and because she was so worried, she took my little brother in a buggy and she said, you children have got to stay in a house. And if an alarm sounds, she's make sure you go into the cellar. I have to go back, and they called me to come back in the city. And it was always a Gestapo car that would pull up. Never gave her a ride. So she said, I have to go. So she left us both home. And I was in the house doing some dusting and helping out with things that my mother left for me to do. And Peter was outside weeding in the garden. And at that time, Peter was 8 years old. I was 7. And all of a sudden I heard him holler, stop, please stop. And I went to the window and I looked out and there was this Gestapo's son, his name was Drucker. I will never forget that boy as long as I live. He was in the garden and he had Peter pinned down and he had his knees on Peter's arms and he was sitting on his chest and pounding him in the face. And my brother's face was one mass of blood. Well, I saw stars. I picked up the broom. I ran outside. I turned the broom around and I started beating him with that broom. I didn't care where I hit him. And he turned around once and looked at me and I whacked him right across the face. And I kept hitting him so hard. I was intending on killing him. Anybody would do this to my brother Peter. He was my best friend, my only friend. And I helped Peter up. And all I did was cry. I said, oh my God, Lord, please don't let Peter die. All the blood gushing from his nose and his mouth. And it was horrible to see him like that. And I helped him into the house. And I took washcloths with cold water and put him to try to stop the bleeding. And the door opened and my mother came home. And oh my God, just to see her was just like, I couldn't believe it. And she said, Marlies, what happened? I said, it was Drucker. He came here and beat Peter so bad. And my mother said, oh my gosh, Marlies, what did you do? And I said, I hit him with a broom. And she said, don't you know that's a Gestapo's son? I said, I don't care if it's Hitler's son. He had no business beating Peter up. Now, my mother was devastated. And see, I didn't understand this.
Right. Of course. You're just a kid.
And when my father came home, my mother told him what happened. I saw my father turn completely white. I thought he was going to have a stroke. He said, we're all done. We're all done.
Marlies and her brother Peter attended a German school where they endured constant harassment and humiliation. Their schoolmates called them dirty Amis, short for Americans. They'd spit at them, throw stones at them, run their bicycles into their legs, and beat them up almost daily. It got so bad that Marlies asked her mother if they could join the Hitler Youth. The Hitler Youth was a youth movement organized by the Nazi Party and broken into branches for boys and girls from 10 to 18. Its role was to indoctrinate the German youth in Nazi ideology and later to serve as a paramilitary force. By 1940, it numbered 7.2 million, or 82% of eligible German children. By the end of the war, the German militia, known as the Volkssturm, was drafting 12-year-old members of the Hitler Youth into its ranks to help defend Berlin. Jews and foreigners like Marlies and Peter were not allowed to join.
And it wasn't long after there's a knock on the door, and it was the Gestapo in uniform with his son. I looked at his son's face, and there was this welt right across his face. It was the most beautiful sight I had ever seen. And he looked at us, and he said to my father, he said, who did this to my son? And I said, I did. And my father wanted to hit me because he wanted me to be quiet. See, I had no idea what I was doing. And he said, why did you hit my son? I said, because he was beating my brother up, and he should never have done that. And then he said, why wasn't your brother fighting for himself? I said, because he was pinned down, he couldn't. And he said, where's your brother? Tell him to come here. I said, he can't see. My dad wanted me to just be quiet. Well, you know what? So my mother brought him into the bedroom. And incidentally, we never had any, and there were no lights. We were not allowed to use light bulbs. We could only use a candle because light bulbs would show the planes where the houses were. So you could only walk around with a candle, and your windows had to be blackened when you had windows. And so we took him in the bedroom, and when he looked at my brother Peter, he was laying there. His mouth was all swollen. His nose was broken. His eyes were swollen shut. And he looked and he said, who did that to him? And I looked at Drucker and I said, he did. And Drucker, he looked at his son and he said, you did this to him? And he said, yeah. He said, why? And he says, because they're dirty Amis and we don't want them here. And he said, wait a minute. The only reason they're here is because we want them here. They're not going anywhere. He says, have they say anything about Hitler or the Nazi Party or anything? He says, no, they never do. He says, then don't touch them. Just leave them alone. It's our job to watch them.
Right. Not my son.
And he said, just leave them alone. So he told Drucker to shake hands with Peter. And you know, my brother Peter is the nicest guy in the whole world. His hand flew out there ready to shake hands with Drucker. And then he said to me, and you shake hands with my son. And I looked at him and I said, only if he promises never to touch my brother again. And my father wanted to bury me.
Yeah.
And Drucker said, I won't touch him. And that's when I shook hands with him. Well, it took almost 3 weeks for Peter to be able to go to school because it took that long for his face to heal. And the first morning that he walked with me, oh, you should see how early I got up and went to school. I didn't want to meet anybody. And I go by myself now, you know. And finally, when Peter was able to go, we're walking out and we're going down the street. And here comes Drucker with his friends. And a couple of the boys were saying, Drucker, here they come. And Drucker said, hey, wait a minute. He said, Peter, come here. And the guy's looking at him and saying, what do you mean, come here? And he said, Peter, come here. And he turned around and looked at them and he said, just leave them alone. My father said, don't touch them.
Wow.
And Peter started walking with him, right? And then one of the girls turned around to pick up a stone to throw at me. And he says, hey, you better leave her alone. She's mean. I said, I think he learned something. And they didn't bother us anymore. But it was no big deal because it wasn't too long after that, you know, we were bombed out and we had to leave anyway. So that was just a reprieve for a short period of time, but it was nice. And then came an order because the British were now dropping dolls and fountain pens with explosives in them.
Well, from the planes.
From their planes during the bombings. And I have seen on the internet where they have denied that ever happening, which is a lie. Because those were bombs on children. And that was against
horrible.
the Geneva Convention.
Of
We were
course.
not allowed to do that.
Because who's going to pick those up are children?
Yeah, children, yes. And do you know the little girl down the street that my mother used to babysit for her because she actually was a nice lady, she's a German lady, but she let her little girl come and stay because sometimes she had to come into the city and she couldn't take her along. And she would come and stay with us. Well, the day that my mother had to go into the city by herself, a little Krista was brought over to our house. And so the three of us went down in the basement. When the alarm started, right away we went into the cellar. And I looked at her and I said, Krista, if we should happen to die today, have you ever been baptized? And she says, what's that? And I said, you don't know what that is? She said, no. And I said, well, you have to be baptized if you want to get to heaven. And she said, I don't know anything about that. I said, how sad. Your mom never told you about God? And she said, no. And I said, you know what? My mother said that in an emergency, someone else can baptize. And I have some holy water here. And I think I'm going to baptize you just in case we die. I want to make sure you get to heaven. So I didn't know how much holy water I was supposed to use. I had a little bottle. And I took a big bucket of water and I filled the bucket of water and I dumped the holy water in it. And then I dumped it on poor Krista. I almost drowned her. And I said, in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit, I baptize you, Krista. I said, so now if you die, you're going to go straight to heaven.
Yeah.
Poor Krista. When my mother came home and I told her what I did, she said, oh, Marlies, you could have just used a little bit of that water. You didn't need to drown her. You know, the sad part about it was maybe a month later, Krista ran outside because she saw a doll and she picked it up and the doll exploded and Krista died.
Oh,
and so when someone tells me those bombs were never dropped, that's a lie. And Hitler was afraid that his young people were being killed by these bombs, so he made an order that all children had to leave the city. And if he thought he kept them out of the city for a year or so, maybe that would give a reprieve. Maybe they'd stop dropping those kind of bombs. And so the order came that the children had to leave the city, go move in with anybody who will take them in. And if they didn't, they would order you to take them in. And they would now, the parents had no right to go visit them for that year. They could write to them, but they could not visit because that would make the children give them a hard time and want to come back home, you know. So now my grandmother, now on the farms, the farmers, they were no better off than the city people. everything on the farm belonged to the Nazis. All the cows, all the chickens, all the eggs, all the milk, all the grain from the fields, the potatoes, everything belonged to the Nazis. And they left the poor farmer with a sack of potatoes for the whole year. If they had a litter of pigs, they had to raise them until it was time to butcher. Then they were allowed to keep one pig, and the Nazis confiscated the rest of them. And that was all the meat they had for the entire year. They couldn't kill a chicken.
Wow, even though they were raising them. And
Oh,
putting in all
yes,
the
you
work.
had to
Yeah.
raise them, you had to feed them, you had to make sure they were ready for slaughter, and then the Nazis came and picked them up. That was all there was. And they never paid you. They never gave you anything for it. And then the chickens, all the chickens were accounted for. If a chicken died, you had to bring that carcass to them, to headquarters, because you couldn't even cook the chicken.
Wow. Wow.
And the eggs, there
so
was
everybody was suffering.
Oh,
Everybody.
yes, yes. And I think the farmers probably a lot worse because they'd see all this food and they couldn't touch it. And then you had people in the villages that were Nazis, and they would inform on the farmers.
Right.
And they would watch their wagons, how many sacks of potatoes. They would count them with binoculars. And then if the farmer only turned in 12 bags instead of he had 13, they would report that, and the poor farmer disappeared. And every man in Germany that could pull a trigger or could walk, it didn't matter if he was 16 years old or if he was 90. They were all drafted. And if you didn't join the draft, they would shoot you in the door right there. They would shoot you. If you say, I don't want to go fight, they would shoot you. So there was no problem. And there were no draft dodgers in Germany. So now, when they had the farmers and when they said that the people had to go and take in a child, my grandmother said to my mother, she says, I can take one of the children, but I can't afford to feed two of them. And so only Peter was asked to come and live with my grandmother because he could help on the farm. Because it was only my Aunt Ida, my Aunt Clara, my grandmother. And they did give us a Russian prisoner that came and worked for us, who was one of the finest men I ever met. And my grandmother loved him. And when he left our farm, he called my grandmother mother, and he said, if I get a chance to come back, I'm going to come back. But the Americans turned those soldiers or those prisoners over to their own people, and he told my grandmother that Stalin told him and all of the Russian soldiers, if you're ever captured by the Germans and spend any time in Germany at all, you will be shot at the border if they return you. And I believe that's what happened to Vasil, our prisoner, because he never came back. And he had nobody left in Russia. So he said, I'm coming back home. He said,
this is my home now. Yeah.
And that he never came back. So that's why I believe that happened to him. And so anyway, now it's time for us to leave the city. And now my mother's worried about me going to maybe live with a Nazi family somewhere, and they brainwash me or whatever. She says, but where am I going to send my daughter? And my father's sister, who we had not heard from the time we got there. She never contacted us or anything, but all of a sudden she contacted my mother and she said, I would like to have one of your children come and stay with me because we need 3 people on the farm in order to butcher. That's another thing. If you had less than 3 people, you could not even keep one of the pigs. You had to give them all up.
Wow. So if
now,
they had 3, they would keep one of the pigs.
Yeah. If you had 3, then you could keep 1 pig for the year.
Mm-hmm.
So she wanted to know if I could come and live with her for a year.
And you've never met this woman?
No. And so my father said, well, that's my sister. That's a lot better than sending her off to some Nazi family, you know. So they thought that was a great idea. And it happened to be that one of my father's other brothers, his daughter was actually working in Rüsselsheim, and we really didn't even know it. But she offered to take me to go and live with my Aunt Lena in a town called Holztum. I never forget the morning that we left. My mother took both of us down to the train station. I was with this new cousin she was maybe 20 years old. And my mother got on the train going one way down the Rhine with Peter to my grandmother's, and I got on the train going the opposite way with my cousin. And it was a long train ride, and I really didn't know her that well. And I was 8 years old. And when we pulled into the train station, I saw a woman standing there, and I said to my cousin, "Did you see that woman? She looks just like a witch." And my cousin didn't say anything. And when the train stopped and we got off the train, didn't we walk up to the witch?
My
And
God.
I didn't know what to do. And she said, "Oh, Marlies, this is your Aunt Lena." And she says, "I can't stay because," she says, "I have to go on to the next village. And so when the train leaves, I have to get on it." So she said, "Just be happy." And she gave me a kiss on the cheek, and she ran and got on the train. I wanted to follow her because that lady scared me.
As the war continued and the Allied bombing campaign grew increasingly more destructive, the Nazis ordered all children out of the cities. Marley's parents were told that if they couldn't find a relative in the countryside to take Marlies and Peter in, the Nazis would find one for them. Also, they wouldn't be able to see their children for a year. Their grandparents on the southwest border near Luxembourg could only afford to feed one additional child and chose Peter. Marley's father's sister, her Aunt Lena, whom Marlies had never met, offered to take Marlies. Lena wanted her, she said, because the Nazis had taken over ownership of everyone's livestock. And since she and her husband lived alone on their small farm, they weren't allowed to keep a single animal for themselves to slaughter and use for food. With 3 people living at a farm, they would be allowed to keep 1 pig. So 8-year-old Marlies took a train up north to live with her Aunt Lena, and things were about to go from bad to worse. Yeah, from the first sight of her.
First sight that I had of her, she scared me. And she didn't say, "Hello, I'm glad to meet you. I'm your aunt, you're my niece from America." She didn't say anything except, "Pick up your suitcase and put it in that wagon. We got a long way to go." And so I'm only 8 years old. That suitcase was heavy with all my clothes and stuff. And I lifted it up into the wagon, and then I took a hold of the wagon and started following her. And she was tall and she had long legs, and we had to go all the way through the woods. And I had to follow her, and she walked fast. And I was so afraid that my suitcase would fall, and I'm trying to keep up with her. And she didn't say one word to me until all of a sudden she turned around and she said, "The only thing I have to offer you to eat is sour milk and fried potatoes."
Oh, God.
Well, I thought that was a gourmet meal.
Yeah, it's all relative,
Fried
right?
potatoes. Yeah. We never had any oil. We had nothing, right? And sour milk was a lot better than just water. That's all we ever had. We had water, and we made our own coffee. We used to go to the fields and we'd find grain, and we'd bring it home and put it in a frying pan and brown it, and then put it through a coffee grinder and then put hot water on. That was our coffee. I thought it was delicious. And that's all we ever had to drink. We never had milk. And so sour milk, I told her, I was, "Oh, that's fine," And we went to the house, and her husband was there. He had been wounded in the war, and he had very much trouble. He had a lot of trouble walking. So he wasn't drafted. That's why they left him at home. And she brought me into her house, and the way the house was set up, the downstairs part of the house was all barn. Then you went up a flight of stairs on the outside of the house into the living quarters above. And they didn't have any wood on the back of the stairs, and having to go up a pair of stairs where you could see through them scared me to death. I did not. I was afraid of height, and I dragged my suitcase and I hid behind my suitcase each step I took to go all the way up to the top. And I thought, I hope I never have to come down these stairs again, ever. And I got into the house, and she said to me, "That room to the left is our living room. And if you go through the door that's there, that goes into your uncle's workshop. He used to make furniture for children's bedroom sets and stuff like that, and also toys." And she says, "That door that's over there in the corner, I never want to see you touch that doorknob ever." And she said, "Now, to your right," she says, "that first door, that's our bedroom. And the second door, that's your bedroom. And then the whole back of the house was kitchen. And there was a trap door that you could open up and go down a flight of stairs into the barn. And so she said, go put your stuff away and I'll make you something to eat. So I put all my stuff in my room and I went back out in the kitchen and she gave me the sour milk and fried potato. I never saw my uncle. I don't know where he was, but anyway. And so I went, she didn't talk to me. She was in the kitchen and then she disappeared. And I don't know where she went, in the living room somewhere. And I sat in the kitchen by myself for a little while. And then I went in my room and it was funny. She had a desk there. And on the desk was paper and a pencil. And in Germany, if you were a Nazi, I think you had paper that you could write on. If you weren't, you couldn't get any paper to write on. If you found a piece of paper to write a letter on, I remember my mother used to write letters, and every single corner of that letter had writing on it. She would write along the edges, along the top, there was never a spot on that paper that wasn't written on. And we went to school, we had to take blackboards because we had no paper. We had to do all our homework on blackboards. Yes. And they had to be in a backpack, which we called a rucksack. And we had to have them in there. And then on the side were two strings, and there were two things hanging down, looked like two little pot holders. One always had to be wet, and the one above had to be dry. And as you walked into the classroom, that's the first thing the teacher would touch to make sure that that was wet and the other one was dry, and then you could go in your classroom. And that's what we had to do to clean our blackboards.
Yeah. Yeah.
And everything was done with chalk. So now I'm in her house and I look and I see paper laying there with a pencil. And the first thing I did was sit down and write a letter to my mother and said, Mama, please come and get me.
Right.
I don't like Aunt Lena. She scares me. She looks like a witch. I don't like this house. It's dirty. It doesn't look right. I can't stay here. Please come and get me. And I put the letter. I went out to see her and I said, do you have an envelope for my letter? And she gave me an envelope. I put the letter in there and I said, Aunt Lena, I don't know my mother's address. I'm 8 years old. I never wrote to my mother in Rüsselsheim, So I said, would you send this letter from my mother? And she said, just leave it right there. I will. Well, you know what? I was there a year. And in that year, I probably wrote a letter almost every day, at least for a long time. And then I stopped writing. But in all that time, I never got a letter back. And my mother never came. And then I started writing. Before I started writing to my brother and my grandmother in Kell, she took me outside one time and she said, the reason you don't hear anything from your family in Rüsselsheim is because they're dead. They've been killed with the bombs. And that's what I had to live with, to think that my mother and father were really, my brother Johnny, it was actually Siegfried was his name.
Yeah.
That they were dead. And that's what she made me believe. And then I started getting lice. And in that whole year that I was there, I had one bath. I asked her the first week I was there, I said, Aunt Lena, the week is almost up. I'm supposed to take a bath. And when am I going to take a bath? She, you want a bath? So she brought this big tub out and she put warm water in it. When I came home from school, she told me I could take my bath. So I went in a bedroom and I took my clothes off. I came out. I got in the tub. And that room that she told me never to touch, that was the room where she used to take the Nazis when she informed on the town people. That was her secret room in the house. That day that I was in the kitchen in that bathtub, she brought 3 Nazi officers into the kitchen and they were sitting at the table while she was informing on the town people. And I was in that tub and it started getting, so there's no heat in those houses. There's no furnaces, and it was getting cold and I started to shiver and the water was getting cold. And I said, Aunt Lena, could I please have a towel? And she says, get up. Down at the end of the counter, there's a towel. Well, I wasn't going to get up in front of those 3 men. I mean, I'm only 8 years old, but I knew enough that never to walk around naked in front of people. And I was too ashamed. So I sat in the tub and I started to shiver. I shivered so bad you could hear my teeth clatter. And I was shaking. And one of the Nazi officers turned around and he said, she's going to freeze to death in that tub. He got up. He went down and got the towel. He came over and he says, I won't look. Just stand up here. I'll wrap this around you. And he did. And I ran into my room. I must have sat on that bed for half an hour trying to get circulation back in my body because I was so cold. And I never asked for another bath. That was the only time. And then I started getting the lice. And the teacher in school would give me this little bottle of some kind of a medicine that she told me to bring home to my aunt and have her put it on my hair and wrap my hair in a towel and then wait until it started to feel like it was burning and then just have her wash my hair. Well, at that time, my hair was long enough that when I sat down, I could sit on my braids. And I had a lot of hair. I would bring that home and show it to her, and she said, "You didn't get those lice here. You brought them when you came." And I said, "We never had lice in our house." And she would take the bottle and dump it all in one spot on my head. She never wrapped my hair up, nothing. And then the lice would just take off to go to different places till that disappeared, and then they would come back.
Cruel woman.
Oh, and then the lice became so bad that I couldn't sleep in my bed anymore because they were crawling all over the pillows. I started to sleep in the barn. And she had a cow that I believe God gave me as a friend. She was not just a cow. That animal was so kind and so loving. She must have thought I was her calf. Because when I would come home from school, I would go right in the barn and I would brush her and I would talk to her and she would make all kinds of noises back to me and she would lick my face with her big, her sandpaper tongue. I think it was the cleanest thing on me was my face. And I think the only reason she liked licking my face was because I always had tears in my face, always crying. I was so lonesome. And it didn't take the kids in school long to know that their parents wanted nothing to do with me because I lived with an informer. And the people in town were afraid of her. So the children had nothing to do with me. And as I kept getting dirtier and dirtier, they isolated me in a classroom. I had to sit all by myself in a corner because I couldn't get rid of the lice. And the teacher didn't want the other children to get the lice. And so I was isolated. When they went out to play in the playground, they would kick dirt at me or they would throw sticks at me. And if they rolled a ball, they used to say, "Don't touch that." They called me names. And I had no one. No human being spoke to me, greeted me. And then I never missed going to church on Sunday. I would always go to church. And in church even, they made me stand in the back of the church. I couldn't sit in a pew. And I had to stand. I couldn't lean against the wall because the man told me I shouldn't because things would crawl on the wall. And when church was almost over, he would say, "Go, get out, go." And he would make me leave. Because nobody wanted to be in touch with me.
Wow.
And the year went by and I heard nothing from Peter. I heard nothing from my grandmother. And then she told me they were dead as well.
Marlie's time with her Aunt Lena was miserable. Though she wrote to her parents every day, she never heard back. Finally, Aunt Lena sat her down and explained that the reason she hadn't heard from her family was because they had all been killed by bombs. She was shunned at school and badly treated everywhere she went. Her clothes were threadbare, her hair infested with lice, and the only affection she got came from a cow that slept with her in the barn. Finally, after a year, Marlie's parents arrived with her baby brother Johnny to bring her home. When they first laid eyes on her, Marlie's was so emaciated and covered with white lice that they thought she was a ghost. After rescuing Marlie's from Aunt Lena's farm, they returned to Russellheim. More horror awaited them there.
The year was finally up. And my mother had a dream. And in the dream, she saw me exactly the way I looked. She said she saw me sitting at a table and I was writing on a piece of paper, and the paper was all covered with little bumps because my tears were falling on the paper, making these bumps on the paper. And then with my thumb, I was killing the lice that were falling onto the paper. And she saw this in her dream, and she saw a big sore over my eye. And that sore ended up being where the lice had eaten my eyebrow away. That's how bad I was infested. And that's what she saw in her dream. And she woke up and she said, John, the year is up. You have to go to Nazi headquarters. You have to ask them if we can go get her. We've got to go get Marlies. Something is wrong. And this whole year, not one letter has come from her. And he said, well, my sister writes to you all the time. Yeah. And she always tells me how much fun Marlies is having, how many friends she has, and how happy she is. And she says, but not a letter from her. And yet, every time she was in Kel with my mother in the summertime, it was never 2 or 3 days go by, we'd get letters.
Right.
But
It's not
now
like
a whole
her.
year
Yeah.
and nothing. It doesn't sound right. And I had this horrible dream about her. We have to go. So he went to headquarters and he asked. Now, he was told he could never leave the city. We could go see my grandmother. My father could never leave because they didn't want him to tell him about the underground ammunition factory where he was made to work. So he went to ask them, and they knew just where he was going. And he's going to go see an informer. And so they allowed that, but I'm sure they had someone right on his tail watching him.
Okay, so they were watching him, and they
Yes.
knew she was an informer, so he couldn't get away
so
with
they
anything.
let him come there because she was an informer. So now they come to the house on a Saturday with my little brother. I hadn't seen him in a year. And when I left, he had long curly hair. He looked like a little girl. In the meantime, my mother had cut his hair, and now he looked like a little boy. Well, when they came, my aunt was shocked that they came, unexpected. And she said, what are you doing here, John? You should have let me know you were coming. And my mother said, we came to get Marlies. And she says, oh, I'm sorry about that. You'll have to come another time. She's not here. She's in another village. My mother said, why are you letting her go to another? They're starting to bomb the villages too now. You shouldn't let her go to other villages. What if something happened to her? Oh, no. She says, she's fine. So now she said for them to sit down, and they sat down, and she goes in the kitchen and she comes out with a cup of coffee from my mother and my father. And my mother said, Lena, where did you get coffee in the war? And she said, I've been saving that since before the war, waiting for my brother to come and visit me so I could present him with a cup of coffee.
Wow, how evil.
And she had sugar. My mother said, oh my gosh, Lena, you even have sugar? Oh, yes. She says, I saved that too. And my mother was just so disappointed that I wasn't there. And my father asked her a few questions. And my little brother started investigating. And he came into the kitchen. And I was coming out of the barn through the trap door into the kitchen to get food for the pigs. And I saw this little boy there. And I thought, oh my gosh, I hope they don't send another child here and you're going to do to him like she did to me. Oh, I hope that little boy doesn't stay here. Well, he just took one look at me and he went, ugh, and turned around and ran into the other room. And he said, oh, Mama, you got to go in the kitchen. There's a dirty girl there. And my aunt said, oh, no, don't pay any attention. She comes here to work once in a while. He says, just don't pay any attention to her. My mother said, no, I'd like to meet that girl. No. She says, you just sit down and drink your coffee. And she says, because I know you have to get back to the train right away. She says, John said he has to get back to the city tonight. That's what they told him. He could go, but he had to be back the same day. My mother didn't listen to her. She got up and she came walking in the kitchen. And when she did, and I saw her, I thought she was a ghost. And I went over in the corner and I started to slide down on the floor and I said, I don't want to die. And my mother just let out a scream and my father came running. And when she did, I realized she's not a ghost. And I saw my father and I realized and I said, and my father took one look at me and he turned around and he grabbed his sister by the throat.
Wow.
He was ready to kill her.
Wow.
And I yelled at him. I said, don't touch her, Papa. She's with the Nazis. And my father took his hands off of her throat like she was on fire. And he said, what? And she said, hey, John, whatever works. My father said, you're
whatever
with the
works.
Nazis? Whatever
Wow.
works.
Wow.
So my father said, you're with the Nazis? She said, you've got a lot of nerve coming here talking to me. She says, you left this country, became an American, gave up your German citizenship, and then you come back here and you think I'm going to treat you in a proper way? She says, you and your whole brood should be dead.
Wow.
Her intent
Wow.
was to get rid of me so she could hurt my father. That's what she wanted. My mother was so upset. And when I turned down, I realized that was my little brother.
Yeah.
that was just little Siegfried. And I
Yeah.
thought, I didn't even recognize him, and he wanted nothing to do with me. He stayed as far away as he could. My mother went in the bedroom. She opened up the closet to take my clothes, and she said, "Oh my gosh, Marlies, are these your clothes?" And I said, "I don't know how to wash clothes." And she never washed any for me. And she said, "I'm sorry, Mom. They look so bad." And she said, "Oh my God." She took a blanket off the bed and she wrapped it around me. And she says, "Let's get out of this evil place." And they went down the front steps that I never went down again, but I went down with her. And they started heading through the woods. And I turned around and I looked and I said, "Mom, I can't leave. I have to go in the barn to say goodbye to my cow." And she said, "Never mind the animals. Let's just get away from here." She had no idea what I had to leave behind. I walked through those woods to get to that train, and all the way I was crying.
Because of the cow.
I didn't want to ever see that place again, but I cried for my cow, my only friend. And I got on the train and I said, "Lord, please, please, let a bomb fall into that barn and let them kill that cow so nobody can ever hurt her." She was my only friend. And we left there. My father got on one train to go back to Rüsselsheim because he had to be back the same night. And my mother went to Kell to see her family. And when we got there and I walked into that courtyard, my brother Peter came out of the barn with my cousin Carly. And Peter just took one look at me and went, "Ugh," and turned around and went back inside. And I don't think anything ever hurt more because he was my best friend and he wanted nothing to do with me.
Yeah.
But Marlies, she took one look at me. She turned around and she ran home and she came back with a new dress, underclothes, a pair of socks, a pair of her shoes, and a brand new coat that her mother had just made for her. And she said, "Marlies, you're going to be fine when you get new clothes on."
Oh.
And I thought,
gesture. Wow.
someone that was so selfish at one time turned
Yeah.
out to be such a wonderful person.
Yeah. What a
And I thought,
transformation.
the apple doesn't fall far from the tree. My mother's family, they were all wonderful people.
Yeah. Yeah.
And, but so I thank her, that she
of
was
course.
so kind.
Of course.
But I went to see my grandfather who was dying and was still alive at that time. And he was up in his room. And when I walked in the bedroom, my grandfather said, "Oh, Marlies, come here." And I said, "Opa, I can't." I said, "I've got lice and I don't want to come near you." And he said,
Yeah.
"Oh, I had lice in the First World War." And he said, "And I'm dying anyway." He says, "They won't stay with me long."
Yeah.
So he said, "You come here." And he gave me the biggest hug. And he said, and I think that's the first hug I'd gotten in a whole year. And he told my aunt, he says, "The first thing I want you to do not cut her hair off." Because he says, if we don't know what she's been through, and if you cut her hair off and the children make fun of her in school, we don't know what can happen. So he says, go on in the barn and get the Cuprex, which is what they used on the cows. And he says, rub that into her hair with a toothbrush. And he said, "Marlies, when your head starts to burn, you tell your Aunt Clara and she'll wash your hair and those lice will be gone." Well, we went down and they did just that. And I went in the barn and they had a cut off wine barrel that was in the barn, and that was always filled with water for the cows when they came in from the field. And my head started to burn. I told my Aunt Clara, and she took me in the barn and she put my head in that big wine barrel. And when I pulled my head out, it was like someone had taken a pepper shaker and shook it onto that water. There had to be 1 million lice in there.
Whoa, wow.
I was infested like nobody could believe.
Wow.
And then they took one of those lice combs, and they combed all the eggs out of my hair because my hair was almost white from lice eggs. I mean, I was really in bad shape. Well, they cleaned me up and they sent me home, and we went back to Rüsselsheim, and I started coming around pretty good. And then one night we had a bombing. And it was, the British came, someone must have informed them about the Opel factory because they bombed the city of Rüsselsheim in one night, which I found out later on after I did a research and everything, that Rüsselsheim was bombed that night with 400,000 phosphor bombs.
Wow. So it just burned the whole city down.
Oh my gosh, that was nothing but an inferno. And people were coming out of their cellars. When that phosphor hits, there's nothing puts it out except being buried under sand. Because as long as it has oxygen, it burns, and it burns very hot. And that night, our house was burned down. And when morning came, we saw 3 phosphor bombs laying right around us, and not one of them had gone off.
Wow.
And that
Wow.
was another miracle.
Yeah. Wow. So,
So now
all
from-
of you, probably the whole village was destroyed, and
Oh,
you were
Rüsselsheim
fine.
was terrible. It was
Yeah.
really terrible.
Yeah.
And so now we had no place else to go, but my mother had a friend that lived on the Rhine, and she lived down near where the Remagen Bridge was. We were just a mile from there. We moved in with her, but my father had to stay in the city. And he also had to keep all of his papers with him because they kept still making him come and show the papers. So now we're living with my mother's friend, and she had a farm. And all of a sudden we heard, actually, my father wasn't supposed to know that the Americans, because he used to say, go down where Agnes is. Don't go to your mother's, but go where Agnes is, because it's closer to the Rhine where the bridge the Americans will come across. That's where they'll cross. So you got to get close to where the Americans are. They are going to help you. And that's why we went to where she was instead of going to my grandmother's. And sure enough, that's where the Americans, the only bridge left standing in Germany, they crossed that bridge at Remagen, and they came into our village. So now we go back home, and the Americans came through the village. They came in, and they came into our yard where we were, and we had apples there in a bin. And I'd never seen anything look so scary as those guys did. They looked more scary to me than the Nazis. And when they walked up to us, one guy had his hair parted. He was on a tank. He had his hair parted in the middle. One side was all red. The other side was all black. And he looked about as mean as anything I've ever seen. And they got off of the tanks and from their jeeps, and they came into our yard. And my mother went up to him and she said, we're so glad to see that you finally came. She says, we're American citizens. And they looked at her, and she had a very strong German accent. They looked at her and they said, really? How can you prove you're American citizens? She couldn't, because all the papers were in the city with my father. So they didn't believe her and they didn't trust her. My mother said, I can't tell you anything else. I know we are Americans. My children are American citizens. We couldn't speak English. So they didn't believe anything.
Right. You're just
so the
making
first
it
thing
up.
they asked her for, do you have any food? My mother said, all I can offer you are the apples that we just picked. And they said, let your children take an apple. So Peter and I went over. She told us, she says, the American soldiers want you to pick up an apple and bite in it. So we did. When they saw that, they stormed that bin and they took every apple that was in there.
Yeah.
And one of the GIs reached in his pocket and he took out a stick of gum and he gave one to Peter and one to me. And we went behind the barn and I sat down and I said, Peter, you know, all the stories Mom told us about the Americans, that's not true. I said, they look just as mean as the Nazis. They were ready to kill us in a tree.
Right.
And now they took all of our apples. And I said, look how skinny their candy is.
Yeah.
I thought it was candy. It's skinny stick of gum.
Wow.
But for some reason, my father found out that the Americans had crossed the Rhine. And he made his way by bicycle. They had another bombing in Rüsselsheim, and the Nazis must have thought he got killed because he didn't show up for work. He took his bicycle that my uncle had given him, and he traveled by night. And during the daytime, he hid in barns and in forests everywhere he could, so they wouldn't catch him. He came all the way from Rüsselsheim down to where we were on Remagen, and he crossed the street. And a German soldier or American soldiers were coming by with their jeeps and they wanted him out of the street. So one of the guys yelled at him and he says, hey, you a-hole, get your bike out of the road. And my father turned around and he says, well, then we have something in common. We all have one. And the guy jumped out of the jeep, ran over, and he grabbed my father by the arm and he spun him around. He says, who are you? He says, I'm an American citizen and I've been waiting 6 years for you guys to show up and give us a ride home. And that's when they started believing us. That's when they saw our papers. And from then on, we became the cat's meow.
When the Americans crossed the Rhine River and found Marlies and her family in the spring of 1945, the GIs, Marlies said, treated them like gold. They literally saved Marlies' life because when they took her to a hospital, the doctors there discovered she was suffering from a ruptured spleen. Marlies, who was now 11, weighed 42 pounds. Her 5'11" father was down to 90 pounds. The GIs fed them, clothed them, and helped them get their papers and return to the United States. Finally, in late 1946, Marlies and her family returned to Naples, New York, only to discover that the people there now shunned them because they regarded them as Nazis. The local priest wouldn't let her brother Peter become an altar boy, and the Little League coach wouldn't let him join the team. Despite all of this, Marlies considers the United States to be the greatest country in the world. Her heroes are the soldiers that saved them and all of Europe and even Germany from the monster Adolf Hitler, and the soldiers who continue to put their lives on the line to defend us and our way of life. Marlies went on to marry a wonderful man and create a beautiful family and write a great book, Queen of the Bremen. Despite everything she went through as a child, she says she feels blessed. She learned that no matter how bad things become, as long as you have faith in God, respect, and love for each other, you can make it, no matter what. We thank Marlies for sharing her story and her honesty and courage. She's today's hero behind the headlines.
Thank you.